Allah يبارك فيك يا رب. Allah
ماشي
يحفظك. So here it is, everybody. We are starting, inshallah. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Inshallah, right now we're going to be starting our tafsir. A lot of interesting things to talk about today. Sometimes they're going to be a little bit tricky, so bear with me. Don't worry about, inshallah, not understanding something. We'll get it, inshallah, and it's going to be clear for you. Let's start yesterday. We were talking about يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا شَهَادَةُ بَيْنِكُمْ. And believe it or not, we really just worked on the word shahada yesterday, and that pretty much took all the class, because the moment before it, we kind of did an overview of this ayah and the ayah before it and the ayah after it. We also talked about the story that basically led to the revelation for this ayah, and we also went in some details in regards to certain figures, and certainly went in lots of details in the word shahada. And the most important lesson, we learned that there are certain words in Lugha Arabiya that can take multiple meanings. So not because you know one meaning, it doesn't necessarily mean that we would apply it all the way in every single area or every single statement or context. It depends on the word, it depends certainly on the context, and certainly if it's a compound word, then that's another thing to include as well. So يا أيها الذين آمنوا شهادة بينكم. Now we're actually going to discuss the word بينكم, because that's actually an interesting word right there. Let's see, يا أيها الذين آمنوا شهادة, and it was basically getting to the part about talking about if you were to witness, you were to be present, you were to basically see the will. In other words, you're going to rule, you're going to make an oath. We talked about those different
Ayuda
meanings.
explain yani fangol tombo yesa bebe ni levu no la sala sala la ikino me la so man kanich.
Okay, wa alaikum assalam.
It's
So
true. You came with one and now you have another one in your hands.
okay, Bintu, I know you have something important to say, but here we go. So shahadatu bainikum. So when we're looking at the bainikum, that's the tricky part. Well, what does bainikum mean in this situation, and how do we understand this? So bainikum would be number one in Lugha Arabiya. It's important to keep in mind that sometimes there can be some omitted prepositions. Okay, so an omitted preposition, how do I know if it's omitted or not? That's another story in Lugha Arabiya, but the omitted prepositions could be there, and we would basically derive that this is what it means. Then there is an omitted preposition within the sentence, and therefore this bainikum is right there to mean or if the person was amongst you. So bainikum in general, let's look at a couple things right there. So you got a couple prepositions. You got number one right there. This is a pronoun, and you've got this pronoun right there, and this would be a preposition right there. Okay, so how do we understand this? So shahadatu bainikum, so there is a witness, and is the person supposed to be amongst us? Or am I seeing the person? Or is this talking about between? Is this talking about that I was present? Do I have to be present? All of that. So therefore, to understand bainikum, it's basically telling you that it doesn't necessarily have to be witnessing the person going through the stages of death, but it's enough to understand that you were amongst the area, the social relations where this person that basically is a dying person was there, you were there, you were to witness all of that. And this is common in Lugha Arabiya, that there is an omitted verb. Let's look at this one, or omitted preposition, sorry. Let's look at this one. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, بَلْ مَكْرُ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ, that it's basically the plots of the night and the daytime. Is it talking about that the night itself creating a plot? Is it talking about that there is some kind of, let's call it negative energy that we could find during the night and during the day? The answer is no. There's an omitted preposition right there, or sometimes even the context itself is giving me that there's an omitted statement, which is your own plots as human beings and what you cause during the night and during the day. So it's not that there's some negative force, some negative energy that's spreading somewhere during the night and during the day. So just to understand this one, because many times you would see some people coming in, taking the ayat out of context and thinking that, okay, well, this is an indication that there is negative energy, makru layli wa nahar, here it is, and not understand that in order for you to understand the Quran, you really have to go back to the Lugha Arabiya, because in Lugha Arabiya, there would be these omitted sentences, omitted verbs, and where we could derive them based on the sentence, based on the context, in order for us to understand the statements properly. So this isn't talking about any plotting, any negative force that's happening throughout the day and throughout the night, but this is actually talking about the plotting that humans cause throughout the night and throughout the day. Similarly, when it says in the ayah, هذا فراق بيني وبينك, this is not talking about just فراق بيني وبينك and there's that distance, but this is of course including, or at least the preposition ما is basically omitted, but that's also known in Lugha Arabiya. So this is هذا فراق ما بيني وبينك. In other words, this is discussing the different at least the different issues that combines us. These different issues we're going to eliminate, or we're going to limit these relations because of what happened and what you had caused. And same thing here, not بل مكر الليل والنهار بل مكركم في الليل والنهار. Okay, so this would be your own. So right there, makrukum fiha, your own plot during the night and during the day. So we would basically see makrukum fil layli. So that would be an omitted pronoun, the kum, and the omitted preposition fi, but that's known in Lugha Arabiya. That's known in Lugha Arabiya. So just keep in mind that this is proper Arabic. This is not somehow broken Arabic that basically is missing out on certain meanings. Okay, إذا حضر. Now we're going farther, and we're going to talk about these pronouns right there, because those are going to be really important to discuss. Okay, let's see. إذا حضر. What is إذا? The word إذا is basically if, in situations when, if, and حضر. The word حضر actually means to be present. Okay, but here, are we talking about death itself? Is it like a person that's present? Or what are we talking about here? Is the person already in their final stage of death? Or is this person right there? قارب الحضور. قارب الحضور means that they are near death. They still didn't get all the way to the secretion state and to basically their final state, but they were close to that state where certainly they were getting close to death, and they were capable of mentioning their will, capable of disclosing what they wanted, etc. Then in that situation, you were a witness to see and hear and basically communicate with this person that is in a state of a dying person, and therefore you were present. حضر, you were present, you were there to basically communicate, understand, and make whatever whatever their intention or whatever their choices that they had wanted to be heard were there, and you were a witness to see it. You were basically a person that was capable of passing on their will or passing on their wishes. All right. فَإِذَا قَرَأْتَ الْقُرْآنَ فَاسْتَعِذْ بِاللَّهِ, which is very similar. فَإِذَا قَرَأْتَ الْقُرْآنَ. I want you to look at this one because in Arabic language, it kind of seems it kind of seems easier to understand than in the English statement. Let's see. فَإِذَا قَرَأْتَ الْقُرْآنَ. If I were to translate this sentence, and if you had read the Quran, that's when you would seek refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So do I do أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم before or after I start reading? When do I do it? Well, that's the point that we're talking about. That in Lugha Arabiya, it can give you the statement as right there, as if it's telling you not that after you finish reading the Quran or after, of course, you divorce the women, but this is in situations where this person is near that. So right there, if you intend to read the Quran, that's when you're going to seek refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and say, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. So it's not while I'm reading the Quran every few minutes, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Why? Because the ayah says, فَإِذَا قَرَأْتَ الْقُرْآنَ. Okay, so I just want you to keep that one in mind, that sometimes it can tell you the actual verb that would be in a state of a present verb or a state of a past sentence, but what it's telling you is that in situations where you are approaching this act, then this is what you would do. So, same thing. وَإِذَا طَلَّقْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ فَطَلِّقُوهُنَّ لِعِدَّتِهِنَّ. So وَإِذَا طَلَّقْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ, if you had divorced women, then divorce them approaching their waiting period. So what does that mean? If they had already divorced them? No, this is talking about if you intend to make a divorce, intend to make a marriage resolution, well, in that situation, here's what the etiquette in making sure you don't increase the harm on these women. You make sure that you create, or at least you make the divorce resolution or agreement or whatever it is that is to basically not prolong her waiting period. So what does that look like? That would look like that the person is not divorcing, that is the man, is not divorcing the woman, one, in a situation where just give me a second. Oh, just give me a second.
Okay. I have a question at this point, inshallah.
So what that would mean is that the divorce would happen in a situation where the woman, one, is not during her period, two, where he would not divorce her in a situation where he had basically been intimate with her in order to probably make that even prolong the time frame of what her waiting period would look like. So when we're looking at that one, that's why they called it الطلاق البدعي. الطلاق البدعي would be one of these situations where he was intimate with her, but then, of course, she could be pregnant, and then perhaps prolonging the time frame for her waiting period, or he divorced her while she was on her period, and certainly that would add that time frame of when she would be ending her iddah. What is the iddah? So that's a whole conversation that we'll talk about later. Ustazah Umayya, you wanted to say something, dear?
Yeah, inshallah, bismillah. So that means that إذا طلقتم النساء فطلقوهن. That means it's not that the Quran way when he combined between two tenses, present and past. That means we thought that it's if you already.
This is imperative.
Yeah. For that, it's very important to understand, study tafsir of Quran. Otherwise, we understand it wrong. It's very
Absolutely
important. يا وجزاك الله خير.
Absolutely. Lugha Arabiya is key. Without Lugha Arabiya, you cannot
نعم
whatsoever do
نعم
tafsir
نعم
unless
جزاك
you really know Lugha Arabiya in the different methods that the Arabic language presents, the
يا
different statements.
يا
Because if the person, like for example, I guess the most complex one would probably be أتى أمر الله فلا تستعجلوا. أتى أمر الله. طب هو أتى كيف نستعجله؟ هو أتى ولا راح يجي؟
راح يجي.
طب ليش تقول لي أتى؟
This is the Quran style.
This is the Quran.
هذا
There you
عظمة
go.
القرآن ما شاء
هذا
الله.
عظمة القرآن. It
نعم
said أتى أمر الله. The decree of the Lord Almighty had come.
welcome.
It had come. That was in the past. فلا تستعجلوا. Don't anticipate it. Don't expedite it. So
الله
if you're telling me not to expedite it, did it come or is it coming?
الله
Right? So
الله
now in Lugha Arabiya, this is not contradictory. In English, this statement would be an oxymoron. In
What
English, this statement would be an oxymoron. So
what
how do I understand this in Lugha Arabiya? The
what
way we understand it in Lugha Arabiya is that the Lord Almighty, Ata Amrullah, means the decree of the Lord Almighty had been set. Because the Lord Almighty is beyond time, is beyond place, therefore all his decrees to him as if they are present. So your future is present to him. Your past is present to him. He knows
عقيدة
exactly
عقيدة
all this.
عقيدة.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, exactly. All that matters to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is because he is beyond time. So, Ata Amrullah, the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it knows no time. The
Right.
matter of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond time. But
يعلم
he had
ما
made the
سيكون.
decree in the past. And he had made the decree in your past, but the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is also present.
Right. يعلم ما سيكون وما قد كان
Absolutely.
وما لم يكن ماذا
Absolutely.
سيكون إلا إن
Now,
كان
same
يا
thing.
الله.
فَلَا تَسْتَعْجِلُوهُ in regards to you, because you are confined with time.
الله أكبر.
You are
جزاك الله
confined
خير.
with time.
جزاك
You are
الله.
confined as a human being. As a human being, your age is related to time. Your life is related to time. Everything is to you is related to time. And you would even forget the past. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not forget. طب how do I understand when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala نسوا الله فنسيهم? See Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there you go. نسوا الله فنسيهم. Did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forget? No, this is not. Just like the word shahada has multiple meanings, it doesn't mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will forget them. In this context, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will disregard them.
Right.
Not nasiyahum bima'na that he had forgotten them. So that's why in Lugha Arabiya, it's really important to, or in Tafsir, it's really important to understand the structure of the Arabic language, because if you were doing an interlinear one and thinking that, okay, I got everything in place, I took a couple classes in this institute or that institute, and I got some, some vocabulary in place and I can get everything in order. Well, think again, because Lugha Arabiya is very, very vast. Even if a person is probably a specialist in Lugha Arabiya, maybe had an undergrad in Lugha Arabiya, Quran is very deep. The most important books of tafsir that go deep in Lugha Arabiya, in that kind of tafsir, is one, Tafsir al-Kashaf for Zamakhshari. Even though it's only in 5 volumes, but that tafsir is probably the hardest tafsir to read. Number 2, Ruh al-Ma'ani lil-Alusi. Number 3, Tafsir al-Baydawi. Those 3 tafsir, they delve and dig deep in Lugha Arabiya, and they'll tell you, in the situation where this sentence or this word, we basically said it was hal, this is what it would mean. If it was mubtada thani, this is what it would mean. If this was khabar, if this was, and they'll go into all these, let's call them scrutinies, that if you don't really understand that level, you don't really understand what they're talking about, then we would always say, take the moment to first learn Lugha Arabiya before you learn that tafsir. So this is really advanced tafsir. Those
Is it
tafsir
as in the Zilal Quran, the Sayyid Qutb?
No, the Ladal Quran is quite different. The Ladal Quran is, even though Sayyid Qutb is definitely specialized in Lugha Arabiya, but Dhilal al-Quran is very different because Dhilal al-Quran is not necessarily a tafsir per se. Dhilal al-Quran, from the name of it, it means in the shades of the Quran. What he was trying to do, and he was trying to let the words of the Quran be something that people could recognize how it's implemented, the relationship, the correlation between our modern lives and also the Quran. So he would, I would say the words and make the words speak in our modern times and how they're relevant to our life. They're relevant to our political life. You could see that because I guess he was in part of Fidel al-Quran, part of it was written in prison and the other part was written outside of prison. Okay. So you could definitely see the part there that was written in prison, and his sister Hamida would come in to check up on him, give him the papers, and give him just different tools to use for writing and all of that. You could definitely see that the words are carrying a lot of agony. The words are carrying a lot of sorrow, a lot of pain, a lot of political, what is the word? I would say political, I guess,
Mood.
retaliation. You could really see that. It's really interesting. And of course, when you're in prison, you're right there. And of course, in a special cell, when they had already announced that he was going to get basically executed. So then you're going into a different mood than before. And certainly, what was he getting executed for? Well, he was really getting executed for one book, which is al-Hakimiyya lillah, and the words in al-Hakimiyya. The book is not called al-Hakimiyya lillah, but the main statement was al-Hakimiyya lillah. But of course, the book is translated into milestones in Arabic. The name of that book in Arabic, it'll come up, and just give me a second. It'll get there. All right. So when you see في ظلال القرآن, it doesn't necessarily do the tafsir, but it lets you live in those words. And I don't think there's any book that is comparable in its influence on our modern times in letting the Quran relate to our life as much as في ظلال القرآن, to be honest. And Sharawi did an outstanding job. And I think, it's quite interesting. When I was doing my master's degree, I was doing the master's thesis on the neoconservatives' influence and the portrayal of Islam and Muslims in the neoconservatives media. And it's really ironic that they considered that the godfather of terror and terrorism was actually Sayyid Qutb. That one was quite interesting. Why would he be the person that would be considered as the main godfather for that? It was really because of the word al-Hakimiyya lillah, that what we're supposed to be going back to is really Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in terms of ruling, in terms of what we would consider as the main reference for truth, or main reference for right and wrong. And certainly all of those resources that he had written, of course, that was to them, that was enough to prove that this person is basically a dangerous person to the modern Western / secular society. So that al-Hakimiyya, which he had revived, I mean, that's what the Quran talks about. So it's not necessarily something that is new, something that was never mentioned before. No, this was something that that the Quran itself speaks of.
Right. AI
And
give me his book is معالم في الطريق.
معالم في الطريق,
Yeah.
معالم في الطريق. معالم في الطريق, that's the main book that, you know, my professor, Dr. Mustafa Abu Sway, he was going like an exchange professor. I'm not sure exactly what the system is, but he was teaching at Florida State University, and he was teaching Islamic studies there. And to his surprise, that the lectures were getting recorded, and the lectures then became Daniel Pipe's main place of criticism, because he considered that just because he had considered as one of the 50 references, just imagine, he had already listed almost 50 references, books from Westerners, from Eastern, Muslim, different resources for the class, and one of these references was Ma'alim fi Tariq. So regarded that he was a dangerous figure to be in the state of Florida University, because one of the references he had stated was the book Milestones for Sayyid Qutb. But Sayyid Qutb, he cannot whatsoever be the godfather of terror, because what he was talking about is al-Hakimiyya lillah. But to them, anybody that revives the idea of going back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and not necessarily the human mind, or at least not necessarily the human mind, but let's call it the human the human pleasures, that's going to be a danger on the economy, a danger on the politics, that's really driven by the different politicians that are driven by the desires of those that basically are right now considered the godfathers of liberalism and secularism. So certainly you're going to see the Quran being targeted, and somebody that brings the Quran to being a book of practice, a book where we are supposed to be putting it in implementation, and that would basically be Sayyid Qutb. They considered that was enough to prove that this person is carrying the mindset of terror. In documentaries, and I would say that actually comes from the mere ignorance that, and I would really use the word ignorance, because the Orientalist departments, and even though right now they're not called Orientalist departments today anymore, they'll call them Middle Eastern studies, they'll call them global studies, they'll call them philosophy department, etc. A lot of these departments that would study Islamic studies right now, Middle Eastern studies, or global politics, or whatever it is, depending on the department, they don't use Orientalist studies, because Edward Said had exposed in 1979 in his book Orientalism, really exposed the ignorance the West carries in regards to the Muslim world. Even though Edward Said, from his name, a Christian Palestinian that of course studied in Beirut and studied also in the US, but exposed the Western ignorance in regards to the Muslim world, and how their classification of what makes terror, what makes danger, what makes the Muslim world, as what makes the fabric and what makes the mindset of the Muslim world. Edward Said really exposed that ignorance. And I would say those documentaries that were made in regards to understanding the Muslim mindset, the terror mindset, or whatever it is really coming from this ignorance, and classifying Sayyid Qutb as the person that is the mindset of the likes of perhaps ISIS, etc., is absolutely false, is absolutely coming from mere ignorance that the modern Orientalists had been very shallow in understanding STEM. Let me tell you a story. I was in St. Thomas University one time. Okay, this is real. So my friend, not Muslim, invited me to go to her Islamic studies class that she was taking at St. Thomas University. Okay, I went in, and the students, it was a postgraduate class. So the students each had prepared, I guess, like an article or some study in regards to a certain figure that basically is to study and scrutinize the mindset of terror. Okay. Now, the professor, of course, white professor, he was basically presenting himself as a person that studied Arabic in Egypt, that he's professional, he's the professional, he basically knows the mindset of the Muslims and all of that. And of course, the students were giving him this reverence, let's say it that way. And the students, of course, unfortunately, many of them were Muslim, were also being indoctrinated with this mindset that, yes, we're here under this investigation to figure out the dangerous mindset that's basically harming our society and so forth. And certainly, they start scrutinizing different figures, from them Abu al-A'la al-Mawdudi, and different figures that are really considered as more scholastic and more scholars than anything else. And of course, they didn't want to miss out on Sayyid Qutb, and certainly went in details in that regards. But then I wanted to do something to expose the ignorance of their professor. So I said, I was just listening. Here I am. I'm just a guest. So I started talking in Arabic with the professor that had convinced them that he was such a pro in Lugha Arabiya that he was capable of going to the references, the resources to understand the Muslim mindset, and that he's an expert in Lugha Arabiya. When I started talking to him in Lugha Arabiya, he told me, sorry, I forgot my Arabic. It's been a while. Can you talk to me in English? I can't understand what you're saying. Just that exposed him right on the spot. I didn't even go in details. I didn't even say much. It was just starting just a couple sentences. But the Orientalists during our modern times are at a completely different level than the Orientalists that existed before. We're talking about Karl Brückelmann. We're talking about some of those Orientalists that really knew Lugha Arabiya, that really studied Lugha Arabiya at a very deep level, unlike the modern Orientalists. They don't like the word Orientalist anymore because it was exposed. And unfortunately, of course, right now we're seeing that imperialism. So when Edward Said exposed Orientalism, what he exposed it with, he exposed that all of these studies are not necessarily innocent, and what they are related to was really, one, the Secretary of State, and two, it's related to the whole idea and the whole mindset of the Western imperialism, the colonization of the past, and that it's not necessarily an innocent study that is necessarily subjective, and that no, it has its intentions to demoralize, to create an inferior image, to certainly demonize these people, whether we're speaking about African or whether we're speaking about Arab or whether we're speaking about Muslim, that it is to demonize these people, to give them basically demoralize, dehumanize, demonize, all of that, in order to create a certain image in regards to who this person is, and therefore that they would not have the same rights. One, the same rights in using their resources. So African people are basically stupid and cannot whatsoever be given the resources for them to deal with it, because they are never going to be at a level where they are smart enough to understand these resources. So white man would basically be the smart man to have the right to kill these people, take the resources, abuse these resources for the benefit of white man. The Arab, they're basically, hey, they're savage. Not that colonization and what they had basically created is causing all this turbulation and all these different all these different things on the ground in the Middle East. But no, it's basically seen as if, oh, it's their problem. Look at them. They're just always fighting. It's not that. The West and what the colonization had basically caused is right now, this is a result of it. So they would see, well, Iraq is a place of just war. It's like, Iraq was a place of war, or did you basically cause all these wars? Were you basically putting in all these different troubles within that country using your superpower, Mrs. US? Whether we're speaking about Trump right now saying, hey, we're going to take over Gaza. It's like, oh, you're going to take over Gaza. And why, Mr. Trump? Because it has good resources right there. We need those resources, and we're going to take it over. It's going to be for America right now. We need to create and make some really nice hotels. After all, Kushner, he basically told me that that would be a very good area for our probably in the future. We would really make a very nice resort right there. So yeah, what about the people that are living there? We could just clean the area. A nice way of talking about massacres, using the word cleaning. Why? Because these people are dirty. Therefore, we're just doing cleaning. We're not doing anything wrong. We're just cleaning the area. And yeah.
Hijra, another hijra, another.
It's quite. You could see the cruelty, whether in the media or the politicians, in the way they would speak in regards to dehumanizing. So this is dehumanizing because he is Muslim, doesn't really deserve the name to be mentioned, doesn't really, we'll use a different word. We'll basically talk about the people, the hostages that are in Israeli prisons. We'll call them prisoner. We'll call them prisoners. They're just fugitives in prison, but the ones that were taken basically by Hamas, oh, they're going to be called hostages. Why? Because that's a really mean person. He's taking a hostage, and this Israeli person is an innocent person. But those Palestinians that are in Israeli prisons, we're going to call them prisoners because they are coming from an evil or at least a criminal background. Look at the difference. Look at the difference in how they would use these terminologies and play games in manipulating the viewers, manipulating the audience, manipulating the masses. And unfortunately, it definitely is getting, let's say, some acceptance without us realizing. And it plays on the mindset of the people. So we have to be really careful. So yeah, you talked about Sayyid Qutb, you brought him up, and you got me into a different world. So that's okay. All right, so here we go. Let's continue. حين الوصية اثنان. So حين would mean what? So we're right there. حين الوصية اثنان ذوى عدل منكم. So what does it mean, حين الوصية? حين الوصية meaning during or at the time when this dead or this dying person is basically right now giving a statement where they're ready to make a will. Okay, so this would be during that moment, and then the ayah says, well, اثنان ذوى عدل منكم, two people, ذوى. What is ذوى or ذوي or ذو? So that would mean that the person contains such an element or contains such a description, which is ذوى عدل منكم. Now it's talking about somebody that contains what? Contains al-adala. Wait a minute. What is al-adala? Al-adala is justice? No. We're going to get there. So take it one by one, okay? So the adilin minkum would actually mean two men, not two women. So why? Because if it were two women, we would say the ta, not the wa. So the wa would be masculine, and the ta would be feminine. Okay, so now we're talking about two men. Can it be two women? Can it be four women? Well, wait a minute. How come women are not included in this? So one, the scholars had differences of opinions on what women can witness in. Can they witness on money? Can they witness on things that relate to women's lives, like the birth of a child, for example? She's a midwife. Okay, can she witness on that? What is it that they can be witnesses on, and how does that look like, and how many women do we need, etc. So that's a huge debate between scholars. I can take a whole lecture just in discussing the part about women's witness, but to make the story short, the Quran was really clear in Surah Al-Baqarah. We did actually go in details. In Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did mention in regards to women's witnesses that the reason why women would basically need multiple women and not just one woman, it was because if one were to forget, the other one is to remind.
Is it in Ayat al-Mudayana?
Right, Ayat al-Dain.
Yeah.
It's Ayat al-Dain. Now, so that one was pretty clear. In other words, it's not to consider that women are inferior, that they are less religious, that their integrity is less. This is not talking about integrity. This is not talking about their honor being less in any way, in any shape or form. But this is basically talking about their competence and their ability to remember. Okay. And we know that right now neuroscientist studies, so forget about all these different feminist groups that want to say equal rights and blah, 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 all of that stuff. You know, Islam does not go in making rulings based on impulsive choices. Islam takes people's rights and justice seriously and builds it on data. So what we see today is helping us understand that what women go through, whether it's hormonal changes, this is real. This is not some kind of Arabic mindset, traditional mindset, talking about women not having the mindset, etc. But this is actually talking about, one, the Quran itself was emphasizing that the reason for that was the issue and the place of memory. Therefore, are women competent? Is their brain competent enough to make a complete good memory? And is it going to basically be considered competent enough to store, to preserve the data, the information that is going to be used for the sake of these trials, for the sake of such witnessing? is that going to be a valid resource that we could depend on, and a strong valid resource that we could depend on as evidence to make sure that when we're doing that distribution of people's rights, that it would basically stand on firm grounds. So according to the Quran, women's minds or brains, let's say it this way, that it goes through multiple weaknesses, multiple things that make it not competent enough, as strong as a man's memory. And therefore, now, does that mean we have less cells, less brain cells? As a matter of fact, we have more brain cells. But we know that the brain activity is not necessarily just an issue of brain cells. We could definitely multitask, something that a man could never do. To multitask is not something that they're competent to do. But when it comes to remembering certain details or remembering certain things, they definitely are more competent because their body goes through less challenges that affects their brain, or whether it's basically the way that anatomy works and how the dynamics of the brain basically function. That's a different study, but certainly the Quran was emphasizing that it's an issue of memory and not an issue of honor. It's an issue of brain memory and not an issue of honor, and that women go through multiple things, whether it's hormonal, whether it's pregnancy, whether it's different stages, even during the time of probably perimenopausal or menopausal stages, or even during a period or pregnancy. All of these different things can affect memory, making that area to verify and make sure that we stand on firm grounds in terms of verifying people's rights and justice, etc., making it requiring 2 women in comparison to 1 man. Okay, so scholars actually had differences of opinions in regards to this wasiyah, to will. Can we have 2 women as in ayat ad-dain, as in the ayah, ayah 283, I believe it is, in Surah Al-Baqarah? Just like in Surah Al-Baqarah, it was basically saying, well, if you don't have 2 men, then it's فَرَجُلٌ وَامْرَأَتَانِ مِمَّنْ تَرْضَوْنَ مِنَ الشُّهَدَاءِ. Okay, so now it's telling me that it would be 1 man and 2 women equivalent. So 2 women would be equivalent to 1 man in terms of, let's call it, registering and documenting things that relate to at least finances and these areas. Is that always the case? No. If it's related to women issues, let's say the baby was born, etc., then we're talking about a different issue here. We're talking about something that is related to women's life, and certainly we're expecting that a woman probably was the one that was acting as a midwife, giving the woman the care to this woman and the child, etc. So they would usually witness these things, and they have better memory of it than men themselves. Okay, so when you look at إثنان ذوى عدل منكم, is this to make it exclusive that in order to have a will in a situation where death is basically approaching somebody, and here we go, we have the witnesses, can we have, let's say, 1 man and 2 women, or can we only have ذوى عدل منكم, meaning 2 men only, meaning that we cannot necessarily have what would be equivalent as in ayat ad-dain, or إثنان ذوى عدل منكم is exclusive, that it could only be 2 men, even if we were to have 40 women, that would not be that would not make it basically efficient, or at least sufficient, not efficient, but it's sufficient, and therefore أو آخران من غيركم. Now I want you to look at this one. You got إثنان ذوى عدل منكم. Let's go back to Al-Qurtubi for a bit. And ذوى عدل منكم, he said, منكم, okay, and آخران من غيركم. So now you could see what they're going to do these two people, they're supposed to be adl. And what adl means is that they're supposed to be, one, not accused of probably having conflict of interest. Okay? What does it mean to have conflict of interest? So let's say this person made a wasiyah. Okay? And let's say the wasiyah was involving, the will that he's making was involving some amount of money to be given to this person that is a witness, that is one of the witnesses. That's a conflict of interest. So now we're seeing that you would now be a person that's making a witness to basically give you some interest, to give you some benefit. That's a conflict of interest. We need someone else to basically witness that. You cannot make a witness to give yourself some form of support, some form of service, because that's a conflict of interest. Another thing is that a person that is adl, a person that has the religious integrity, is not accused, does not have a history of lying, a person that does not have a history of forgery, does not have a history of, just having, let's say, lacking deen, lacking integrity in deen, then that's a person that is fasiq. And a fasiq, and we talked about fasiq before, a fasiq basically is a person that is not committed to their deen, not committed to the principles, lacking religious integrity. That's a fasiq. Publicly announcing their sins, they don't even care. Well, that's a sign that this person is not taking their religion seriously. And therefore, they definitely are susceptible to certainly lying, or susceptible to forging their witness, and susceptible to basically also not be a person of principle even during the statement where they're probably making a witness. So shahadat al-fasiq turad. We would reject a fasiq's shahada, a fasiq's witness, because we would consider it as not competent. We would consider it as lacking, let's say, competence. Okay. أو آخران من غيركم. Or, let's say, what is آخران من غيركم? ذوي عدل منكم and آخران من غيركم. Okay, so explain that to me. Okay, so ذوي عدل منكم, two witnesses that are just from amongst you. Here's the first pronoun. منكم, from you. أو آخران من غيركم, or two that are from other than you. Wait, so is this you right there talking about the same you right there? And what does it mean? I'm going to break it down for a bit, okay? Pay attention. So the wa'adlim minkum, is this talking about somebody that is competent from the Muslim community, and akharani min ghayrikum? If we're talking about the Muslim community here, that would actually mean ghayrikum, other than you. That would actually involve other than you, meaning other than the Muslims. But if this is talking about minkum to mean from your family, then this would be from other than your family. If this was to mean minkum, meaning the person that was related to the person, that would mean the person that was not related to the person. Okay, not necessarily family. Okay, and that's that area of debate. That's that area of debate and how they would basically understand and that lugha Arabiya and what that means. So you had some scholars actually say, this is talking about, this is the majority, okay? The majority of the scholars, let's look at them, okay? the majority of the scholars, they basically said, here's the first opinion. And he basically said they had three differences of opinions. The first one was, well, this minkum is involving, let's write it down. We're going to use a different color so we can see it better. Okay. So talking about this minkum is talking about from you, meaning the Muslims. Okay. And then therefore, if we're talking about Muslims here, then what would be in contrast to the Muslims would be the people of the book. So this, or people of other faith. Okay. So this pronoun would be غَيْرِكُمْ, would be other than you. So other than the Muslims. But if we're saying this is talking about family, then this would be the people that are not family. Okay. So let's see those opinions. Okay. So the group of scholars, the first group of scholars, they said minkum is basically talking about Muslims, and akharani min ghayrikum, and which is this one. This is talking about non-Muslims, and therefore, based on that conclusion, they basically said, at least those scholars, that the witness of the people of the book on the Muslims is basically permissible in, not in all situations, but in situations where they were on a journey and there was a will. So wait, go ahead.
So can we say that Arabic language in Quran is حمالة أوجه, because sometimes they speak about the Muslimin, sometimes about in this state about the kuffar, but in condition to be at the traveling state, right?
So in Lugha Arabiya, certainly we definitely do have multiple meanings, and that's what we're seeing right here. But this has to be within the parameters of Lugha Arabiya. That way, that way you won't be making your own tafsir. So you would have to go back to the scholars, and the scholars. Why am I going back to the scholars? I mean, why can't I also be that person to make such a statement? Because in order to make any interpretation, it has to be within the parameter, one, of Lugha Arabiya, two, that it is also supported by the Sunnah, and three, well, I should have actually put three as number one, but that the Quran itself would basically support. So when you're talking about the scholars basically had embraced the knowledge in Lugha Arabiya, the knowledge in Sunnah, the knowledge in Quran to understand the different qira'at, etc. So because they embrace all that, they have been doing their homework. That's why we would basically take the prescription from them. So why would you go to a doctor to give you a prescription? Why can't you just, hey, ChatGPT, give me a prescription for this? Because
MashaAllah.
you have to go back. You have to go back to those that embrace those sciences in order to make sure that you're not missing out on something. Same thing. In order to make sure you're getting the right prescription, you would have to go back to a physician, a specialist, and that specialist would basically do a lot of studying, would spend years and years of studying what probably harms the kidney, what harms the brain, what harms the heart, what harms this, and so many different things in order to consider and take in consideration the different aspects that basically would match your situation. Okay, and that's the prescription, that it's given by a doctor to match your situation, because just because you have a certain disease, it doesn't mean that this is the medication for it and that's it, because you might have a kidney problem, you might have a heart problem. Maybe it differs from a male, female, age, perhaps, weight, just different factors are needed to be basically taken in consideration in order to make a prescription. And that's the same thing in Lugha Arabiya. In Lugha Arabiya, or in Tafseer al-Quran, the part about, let's call it, the part about Lugha Arabiya, the part about Tafsir, the part about Quran, the part about Sunnah, all of that needs to be taken in consideration before we make our shallow interpretation. So what we're seeing right now, we're seeing many of the neophyte and very, I would say, du'at al-ilm, let's say people that would claim ilm, they probably took some institution here and there, and they would then come forth, and they probably might have some Arabic background, maybe they were born, I don't know, Palestinian, Egyptian, whatever it is, and then they would think that just by knowing a different language or knowing some Arabic, that's enough to basically make that person qualified to learn and to basically start giving durus on tafsir. Tafsir requires that the person would go back to the scholars' books, to those resources, and not make their own tafsir out of mind like that and start using just different narratives, because that's going to take them out of what the Quran is actually saying.
Yeah,
We'll go back to the scholars themselves.
Yeah. So al-ummi can define it now, that we understand what you are explaining, mashallah, that al-ummi doesn't the person who can't read or write, but who don't study tafsir. Well,
there's definitely a difference. If I was giving a tafsir class for someone that is probably, like you said, ummi or illiterate, I would definitely make it something that is rather, one, very simplified. Two, I would definitely summarize everything. I'll probably just really just make it into maybe a 2-minute tafsir, and that would be very shallow. It doesn't give everything, but at least it gives the person an idea of what this is talking about.
yeah, I mean أمية التفسير itself, أمية التفسير يعني
Right. Well, so
the
basically illiteracy, whether we're speaking about Lugha Arabiya, literacy in the science of tafsir, the literacy in understanding tafsir, etc., that this is extremely important to go in details, to go to the actual books that teach tafsir, to the actual books for the scholars that that basically had that ilm in all over the place, in order for us to make sure that we're understanding the Quran right, and making sure when we're speaking about an ayah that involves legislation, that we're not creating our own interpretation and therefore eventually have a wrong implication and a wrong fatwa, but we would have to go back to the scholars in order to make sure that we're understanding everything properly.
May Allah
Okay.
keep this ni'mah for us. Continue studying tafsir through your classes, inshallah.
الله يرضى عنك يا رب وربي
الله
يحفظك. All right. So now we're looking at the word minkum right there. We could see that if we are to say the pronoun is regarding Muslims, that would mean غيركم would regard the non-Muslims. In other words, we're talking about Ahlul Kitab. Okay, so you want to do that comparison, because it doesn't make sense if I'm talking about fruits and vegetables, for example. I'm talking about produce in general. Okay, it doesn't make sense if I'm omitting something or deducting something, that I'm deducting something that's irrelevant to whatever. Okay, so if I'm talking about the produce, then that's not from the produce would basically be something, or if I'm omitting something out of that, that would be basically from nafs al-jins, from the same type of things. So if we're talking about Muslims, then what would be from the other type would basically be the disbelievers. If I'm talking about family in this pronoun, then this would be from the same type, which would be basically be non-family or non-relatives. Okay, so this is just to keep that one in mind. Okay, let's see. And well, so what's the evidence that this was involving Muslims and not necessarily talking about family? So number one, he said, ما تقرر من الأحاديث. Here's the evidence. Why did you say that this pronoun was involving Muslims? He said, well, number one, I've got the evidence. I've got بسياق الآية. I want you to see the stages that he went to. He said, well, in order for me to make the proper tafsir, he said, the siyaq al-ayah. He said, the context of the ayah. Number two type of reference. What's the best way to do tafsir is, first I would have to go back to Quran, giving tafsir for Quran. Two, the ahadith and the sunnah to give me the tafsir. And three, in Lugha Arabiya. or of course, other resources as Sahaba explaining, etc. So number one, he said, well, the context of the ayah is basically indicating that this minkum is involving Muslims and the ghayrikum is involving non-Muslims. That's number one. Two, he says, مع ما تقرر من الأحاديث, and also the resources that we would find in a hadith. Basically, one, the story involving Tamim al-Dari and Adi ibn Badda. So now we have, that's the story, and we had seen that it was narrated Bukhari, Daraqutni, we had seen in Tirmidhi, we had seen in different resources talk about the story for the ayah's revelation. So now we would know that this was involving two Christian men and a person from Bani Sahm that was involved in the ayah. So therefore, we've got the context right there. And he said, and plus, here's another evidence. He said, and it is also the interpretation of three of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ who had witnessed the revelation of this ayah. And to note, it was Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, it was Abdullah ibn Qais, it was Abdullah ibn Abbas. These three Sahaba had basically stated that the reason for the revelation was involving Tamim al-Dari and Adi ibn Badda. So therefore, this was involving that. So now we've got three types of evidences. So therefore, now he's summarizing the ayah. So now he says, well, that would mean that the ayah would mean as follows, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is informing us that the ruling in regards to witness during a state of will when someone is basically facing death, that their witness would need to have two men or two competent witnesses. And in the situation of travel, or which is basically the metaphor of striking on earth, if there was no other believer to basically do the witnessing part, then in that situation, the witnesses would be basically whoever is present from the disbelievers, and therefore if they were to come forward and present their witness on the will, and they would make the oath after prayer that they would not be liars, or that they had not created or basically committed any fraud witness, and that what they are witnessing on is basically the truth, and they would not conceal what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically been present, or at least been in complete knowledge of, and that they would be considerable witnesses, and we would judge based on their statement. Yet if it was discovered that they had lied about it, they had betrayed, then in that situation, they would have committed a sin. And then in that situation, we would basically look at the guardians for the person that made the will, and we would ask them to come forward, and certainly come forward and give their witness and make the oath. And therefore, the two witnesses that had committed the lie, we would basically fine them for the false witness that they had made. And in that situation, remember that jug, that silver jug, that they basically had sold and lied about it. So this would be, let's see, Abu Musa al-Ash'ari, Sa'id ibn Musayyab, Yahya ibn Ya'mar, and Sa'id ibn Jubair, Abu Mijlis, Ibrahim, Shuraih, and you got all these different, of course, some of them are Sahabi, Tabi'i as well. So all of these are basically Tabi'in. Well, Ibn Abbas is not. Okay, so those would all be Tabi'in and Sahaba that basically said that that's what it means. Okay, and also other fuqaha. Well, this is not a tabi'i, but other fuqaha. Okay, so all of those basically said the same thing. Okay, so it is 1:52 right now. And what we'll do, there's a lot of details so to discuss. Tomorrow is Saturday. So tomorrow we've got fiqh al-ibadat, y'all. Am I right? Is it tomorrow? Oh no. We'll see. If Noura's here, she would actually tell me. Hold on. Is Noura here?
Yeah, I remember on Friday and Sunday.
Right.
Guys.
Fiqh al-ibadat. Okay. Okay, so we'll see, inshallah, and we could be getting fiqh al-ibadat, so excited about that. So stay tuned, a lot of different things to discuss about fiqh al-ibadat, so don't miss out on that.
But this, the timing of fiqh al-ibadat on Friday, it has two timing, 8 to 10. Then in the other announcement, it says 7 to 9, which is right.
Okay, let me ask Noura. We'll make sure we modify those those different timings, inshallah. We'll make it clear, inshallah.
Inshallah.
Alright.
I asked her last 2 days, and she said we'll fix it. But mashallah, she is busy with many classes.
She's right now traveling. She's right now traveling.
I
So,
see.
yeah, that's why she's not present today.
Right.
Yeah, she's basically helping us do some things for Gems of Light.